Chapter 13. The Gap Between Sensation and Choice. A person does not usually lose control in a dramatic way. Control is rarely lost as a single event. It is lost through compression. A sensation rises, and the mind treats the sensation as immediate truth. The body tightens, the inner tone sharpens, and a response begins moving before the person has fully noticed what is happening. Later, looking back, they describe it as if something took over. They say they snapped, spiraled, froze, or shut down. They speak about the moment as though it happened to them rather than through them. Between sensation and response, there is almost always a gap. The gap is small. It can be a breath, a slight pause in speech, a moment of looking away before answering. It can be no more than a second, and often it is less. Yet that gap is where agency lives. Without it, the person does not choose, they react. They become an extension of whatever internal weather is present. With it, even briefly, the person remains a person. They can feel the current and still decide where to place their feet. Most people do not notice the gap because they do not notice sensation early enough. They notice it when it has already become impulse. By then, the body is moving, words are forming, the response has momentum, and momentum is persuasive. It convinces the person that they are simply expressing what is true, when often they are expressing what is activated. Activation is not deception, but it is not judgment. The nervous system produces sensation faster than the mind can interpret it. A shift in tone from a colleague can register as threat before it registers as sound. An ambiguous message can produce a physical tightening before a coherent thought appears. A mistake can create heat and urgency before the facts have even been clarified. The body prepares for defense immediately because that is what bodies do. The mind arrives a moment later and begins explaining. It says, "This is unacceptable, this is disrespect, this is a problem, this is dangerous." The explanation feels rational because it is wrapped around a real sensation. But sensation is not verdict, it is signal. Signals can be useful, they can also be misleading. The body is designed to detect risk. It is not designed to interpret office politics accurately. It is designed to keep you safe. Safety mechanisms often overshoot in modern life because modern life contains constant symbolic threat. The body responds as if a social risk is physical, as if the possibility of embarrassment is a predator. This response is understandable. It is also the foundation of countless unnecessary reactions. The gap is the place where the worker learns to honor the signal without obeying it. This is what separation actually means, not numbing yourself, not pretending you do not feel, not trying to become calm by force. Separation is the ability to feel what rises and still not become it. It is the ability to let sensation exist without letting it write the script. This is why even a second matters. A second is long enough for the mind to regain its role as a chooser rather than as a commentator writing on top of reflex. The earliest form of this separation is noticing. Noticing is not analysis, it is simply the awareness that something is happening in the body. The jaw tightens, the chest compresses, heat rises, the impulse to interrupt appears, the desire to end the conversation appears. The mind begins forming a harsh sentence. These events are usually treated as parts of reality, as justified movements, as expressions of truth. Noticing treats them as events in the system. It does not deny them, it does not explain them, it simply sees them. Seeing is already distance. Distance does not remove feeling, it changes relationship. The person is no longer fused, they are aware that a state is occurring rather than convinced that the state is the world. This small shift is the beginning of the gap. If the worker can notice the tightening early, they can delay the next move. They can let the first impulse pass without acting on it. They can allow the sensation to crest and fall slightly. The sensation may still remain, but the immediate compulsion weakens. Compulsion requires fusion. The mind often resists this because fusion feels like honesty. People assume that acting on what they feel is authenticity. They assume that pausing is suppression. Yet pausing is not suppression. Pausing is integrity.
It is the refusal to let the nervous system dictate behavior in a way that later violates your own standards. The gap is not a place where you lie. It is a place where you choose what kind of truth you want to express, and whether expressing it now will serve the situation or merely discharge tension. Discharge can feel like relief, but relief is often expensive. A person sends the sharp email and feels immediate release, then spends the rest of the day managing fallout. A person speaks harshly in a meeting and feels briefly powerful, then finds trust damaged in a way that takes months to repair. A person avoids a hard conversation and feels immediate comfort, then watches the problem grow until it becomes unavoidable. These are all the same pattern. Sensation rose, impulse followed, action occurred without gap, and the person paid later. The gap is a refusal to pay later for relief now. This refusal is subtle because it is not dramatic self-control. It is simply a slight delay in the chain. A person who has trained the gap does not look robotic. They do not look detached. They often look calm because their reactions are not immediate. Their responses arrive with proportion. Others experience them as composed, but what is actually happening is mechanical. Sensation arises, the person notices, they let a fraction of time open. In that fraction, they choose. Choice is not always noble, it is simply deliberate. The value of the gap is that it makes deliberation possible even in small ways. Without it, the worker becomes a predictable machine responding to predictable triggers. With it, the worker becomes less predictable to their own reflexes. They can choose a different tone. They can choose to ask a question instead of making an accusation. They can choose to wait for more information. They can choose to say nothing for a moment, not as avoidance, but as accuracy. Accuracy is what reflex rarely delivers. Reflex responds to the sensation, not to the situation. It responds to how the moment feels, rather than what the moment requires. A person can be completely justified in their emotional reaction and still respond in a way that is strategically foolish. They can be right and still be damaging. The gap is what allows a person to be right without being reckless, to be upset without being destructive, to be under pressure without becoming chaotic. It also allows a person to remain aligned with the future they claim to care about. Much of adult regret comes from moments of collapsed gap. The regret is not always about what was felt, it is about how the feeling was allowed to become action without consent. People regret the harsh tone, the impulsive decision, the unnecessary escalation. They recognize later that their behavior was not their best self. Best self is often used sentimentally, but it points to something real. There is a version of you that exists when the gap is present. That version can tolerate sensation without needing to express it immediately. That version can choose. A steady mind is not a mind without sensation. It is a mind with gap. This is why training does not begin with philosophy. It begins with micro-timing. It begins with becoming aware of how fast the system moves and learning to slow the chain by a fraction. Most people wait too long. They attempt self-control at the moment of explosion, when the nervous system has already committed. Training is earlier than that. Training is noticing the first tightening, the first rush, the first narrowing, and treating that moment as the true moment of choice. The gap is also where narratives are interrupted. When sensation rises, the mind immediately begins assigning meaning. It starts telling a story about what this means, what this says about the other person, what this implies about you. The story often amplifies sensation. It adds fuel. It turns a momentary physiological shift into a full emotional climate. The gap disrupts this escalation because it prevents story from being acted out instantly. It allows the worker to see that the story is forming and not treat the story as fact. Fact is slower than story. Story arrives fast because it is built from habit. Fact often requires inquiry. It requires asking what actually happened, what was meant, what is known, what is assumed. In a reactive state, inquiry feels like weakness because inquiry delays discharge. The gap makes inquiry possible because it makes delay acceptable. It gives the mind permission to remain uncertain for a moment without trying to resolve uncertainty by acting. This is one of the most important shifts a person can make. A person who cannot tolerate uncertainty becomes either aggressive or avoidant.
Aggression tries to eliminate uncertainty by forcing an outcome. Avoidance tries to eliminate uncertainty by leaving the situation. Neither produces clarity. Both produce short-term relief. The gap makes a third path possible: staying present, staying engaged, and letting clarity be earned through observation rather than forced through reaction. The gap also changes how a person experiences temptation. Not only the obvious temptations, but the daily temptations to check for reassurance, to seek distraction, to abandon a task when it becomes uncomfortable. The urge arises and the person usually obeys without thinking. This obedience becomes identity. I'm the kind of person who can't stay with things. I need stimulation. I need pressure to work. The gap interrupts this identity formation by inserting choice. The person can feel the urge and not move. That single act is small, but it changes the mind's understanding of itself. It proves that sensation can be present without obedience. Proof matters more than intention. A person can want to be steady for years and remain reactive if they never experience the gap in practice. Steadiness becomes real only when there is repeated evidence that the chain can be slowed. Evidence accumulates through small moments: not sending the email immediately, letting the meeting end before responding, taking a moment to reread a message without tone, returning to the task instead of seeking relief. These moments are not dramatic, which is why many people discount them. Yet they are precisely the moments where the mind is being trained. Training is repetition of choice. The gap is not an abstract concept. It is felt. It has a texture. It can feel like restraint, like holding back. It can also feel like space, like widening. It often feels slightly uncomfortable because it prevents immediate discharge. This discomfort is one of the reasons the gap is avoided. People want to feel better now. The gap asks them to tolerate a small amount of discomfort in order to preserve the larger structure of their life. This trade is rarely framed explicitly. It happens in seconds. The worker either tolerates the discomfort or discharges it into action. A steady mind learns to tolerate the discomfort, not as a moral achievement, but as a practical one. The worker recognizes that discomfort is not always a signal to change behavior. Sometimes it is simply the nervous system adjusting. Sometimes it is the cost of not obeying impulse. The person does not have to like that cost. They only have to be willing to pay it. Over time, the cost decreases because the nervous system learns that it does not need to escalate to be heard. The system begins to trust the mind's ability to remain present. This trust changes the entire experience of emotion. Emotion becomes less of an emergency and more of a passing condition. The person still feels anger, still feels anxiety, still feels disappointment. But these feelings no longer automatically produce a chain of behaviors that makes life harder. The person becomes someone who can feel strongly without acting recklessly. They become someone who can be under pressure without becoming chaotic. They become someone who can experience internal weather without turning it into external damage. All of this begins in the gap, not in a grand philosophical shift, but in the smallest unit of agency, the fraction of time between sensation and choice. That fraction is where the clear worker is trained, and it is trained not by suppression, but by the repeated decision to stay present long enough to choose what will actually serve the moment rather than what will merely relieve it.